So, brothers and sisters, we were here at 12 o'clock. We started speaking, and I realized we hadn't hit the go live button. So, here we are. Thank you for joining us, Asanteni, Karibuni. We'll be speaking about our brother Steve Biko today, who is now an ancestor, but has left words of wisdom for us. Again, my name is Nduko. I am a Black woman who has had it with the oppressive system, the exploiters, the imperialists, and who is deciding to do something, joined by my brothers. Welcome again, Brother Adisoji, Brother Milton.
Yes, the name again is Adesoji Genla Ekudedewi, as we would say in Yoruba. Please welcome to this time. Reaching you from the hearts of empire, the belly of the beasts.
The original sin.
May they never
The
forget.
empire on which the sun never sets. And yes, the one that gave you all the language you're about to start speaking. Yes, reaching you from London. Welcome to Kumbukeni. And again, we're going to explore another, how shall I say it, liberator, mind liberator in the person of Stephen Biko. But before further ado, I'll pass the mic over to Brother Milton Almadi.
Thank you. Welcome, sisters and brothers, comrades, friends. Welcome to our weekly open university. Milton Alimadi, based in the United States, the declining empire. Just like Britain went through that phase, we are now seeing all the manifestations, the United States going through that phase. So we at Kumbukeni, of course, bring you the wisdom of our ancestors and show you the relevance in using some of those blueprints that they left with us in dealing with our contemporary challenges. And of course, Steve Biko, who was murdered at only the age of 30, was one of those brilliant griots. And you will see the relevance of his wisdom in today's discussion. So welcome, Karibuni.
Yes, Brother Adesoji, we're going to start with you. If you can please tell us just a little bit about our brother Steve Biko so that the community knows who we're talking about.
Yes, tragically, on September 12, 1977, the world will find out that Steve Biko succumbed to his injuries at the young age of 30. And we've been here before. Most of the African leaders are cut short in their 30s. I wonder why that particular decade. But suffice to say, his legacy before then was one of community. Underline the word community. And to quote another great brother, what's his name now? Stokely Carmichael, otherwise known as Kwame Ture. Biko's powers lies in the positive angle of communal organization, which was organized. Born on December 18, 1946, in South Africa, Steve Biko would show remarkable resilience as a young intellect from a very young age. So much so that he was billed to become a medical doctor. He went into school, University of Utah to be exact, only to get there and realize, listen, there is more to be done out there as opposed to what his powerful cast out for him. So in so doing, he would form the first of many organizations which he will be part of, which was the South African Student Organization, with the acronym SASO, which aimed to foster Black pride, empowerment, and of course, unity. But Biko's power lies in the power of the gift of words, both in writing and speech. As we'll go through today, we'll be delving into his posthumous uh, book based on his writing titled I Write What I Like. And why not? We should all write what we like. And so, on that basis, let's begin.
Thank you, Adisoji. I remember as a child encountering the first time I encountered Steve Biko was when I watched Cry Freedom. And I remember being very torn about it. I don't want to describe the details of what happens in the movie that makes you just realize how awful the people we are talking about that have invaded our continent and our people and our culture and our lifestyle are. But to be so fearful, and Steve Biko talks about fear at the end and how it is both on us and on the oppressors, the thing that is driving the way that we behave. To be so fearful that you treat a young man who is not threatening in any way to you in such a way, for me, was just unbelievable. I never forgot Cry Freedom throughout my life. And I remember connecting with different South African events as we were children in Kenya, watching movies. I remember in high school rebelling against the Catholic priests and deciding to change our father into the way they were singing it in Sarafina and getting in trouble for it. So, yes, a very inspiring brother. And now sitting with him in I Write What I Like, it is I have come full, is it full circle, they say? Yes, as far as connecting with Brother Steve Biko. So he speaks about many things, and Brother Adisoji, you mentioned Black only spaces. That's a place I think we can start. And I want to start there because you talked about SASO, and they're struggling as they begin SASO because the white students are complaining. They are attacking them and accusing them of being racists, racialists, because they're building this space that they want to be Black only for several reasons. And we can discuss what the reasons were. So, Adesoji, Milton, Brother Alimadi, what do you both feel about Black only spaces? Are they necessary? Do we need to move into them in order to get to liberation? Can we work without having them and still get liberated?
Well, thank you, sister, for that question. But for listeners, comrades that may not be that familiar with Steve Biko, Brother Desoji said he succumbed to his injuries. For anyone that is not familiar, those injuries were inflicted
Yes.
by the South African racist police who had detained Biko and essentially just hammered his brain until his skull cracked and he died. So that's how he had sustained those injuries. And then denied him treatment for a very long time. And then when he was about to die, transported him over a long distance, just basically dumped in the back of a vehicle, sustaining additional trauma to the injury that he had already been inflicted upon his brain. So he was killed in a very brutal way by the South African racist apartheid regime. Now, to answer the questions in terms of Black spaces, of course, liberation struggles are different. So we have to analyze them within their given context. In South Africa, you had an apartheid racist regime, a government of white people, for white people, by white people. So you had this system of official, legalized racism in every institution, every aspect of South African state, whether education, whether culture, whether even religion. He talks about how 90% of the congregants are Black Africans and 90% of the church leadership white, whether it's the economics, whether it's the industries, whether it's the living areas, the living spaces you're allowed to live, every aspect of the apartheid state. And then you have the emergence of the liberals, who then anoint themselves as the spokespersons for the oppressed majority in South Africa. And obviously that was untenable. And that is why Biko and other young activists created another organization, South African Students Organization, because they said that the predominant organization, the National Union of South African, NUSA Association, was not and could not articulate the interest of the masses, of the African masses who were being oppressed. They could, at some level, maybe have an understanding of it, but they could not have a total understanding because they were not experiencing that type of oppression. So in the context of South Africa, absolutely 100%, they needed to create that Black space. And in fact, the struggle against apartheid intensified after the creation of that space. Because had they continued operating only within NUSA, what would have been this incentive or the motive to come up with the concept of Black consciousness? Black consciousness was meant for Black people to realize that they should, they could, and they must actually speak for themselves. They were the best people that could articulate the suffering that they have been enduring and were enduring. Hence the emergence of Black consciousness. And it says the first thing that you need to do is, of course, to reject the inferiority complex that had been historically created and disseminated by the white ruling establishment. Beginning from a young age at the schools, when Black students are taught to sing the praises of the white masters, they're taught that history begins in 1652 with the arrival of the Dutch Afrikaner to South Africa. They're taught that their religion, African spirituality, which connected them to the natural environment and the soil, was barbaric.
Yeah.
And in fact, we needed to have a designated day where we go to pray to God, a God whom he found very mysterious. He said, how could a God create human beings and then after a short time on earth subjected some of them to hell, where they are they are tortured in perpetuity? What kind of God is that? And that was the one that was presented as a true religion. And the African gods, the ones that Africans pray to on a daily, constant basis, the ones that Africans acknowledge when they're about to eat, when they're about to drink, when they're about to do anything. In other words, they didn't need to designate a day to go pray. And yet, this is the God that was castigated and denigrated as superstition. So obviously, to articulate all these elements, they needed that Black space.
Adesoji, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'll go back to a key date here. He was born in 1948, 1948 being the start of the apartheid state.
Right.
And so with the apartheid state, what you then had was, Americans will be familiar with this, was segregation by skin tone. So much so that a special class was even created, colored. So if you're mixed, you're in between. So, and in so doing, anybody looking at that would say, but I mean, you have your own spaces, but these spaces where the land was essentially barren, and they were called Batustans, places where nothing grows, but you were expected to come in and work in the places where you've been kept out of. So I think Biko, in advocating for a separate space, was not saying it just in the physical sense. It's also in the mind space, because most of their schools were barren. What's his name? Robert Sobukwe, in his experience before the past rejection movement started, also highlighted the fact that, yes, not only did you create this institution, but you created them in such a way that the product out of those institutions was self-determined. If the schools lack basic materials or can only study certain subjects, you've already predetermined an entire generation what they will become, an underclass. So he goes and says, in the hands of the oppressor, the most potent tool is an abused mind. And everywhere in that book, I write what I like. Biko was clear and was clear in every facet that your dignity, the dignity of the Black person, doesn't lie in what the quote unquote the oppressors suggest they be, but you go inside culturally. Again, Brother Amika Cabra will build on, because the basis of his revolution was one of cultural revolution. So that was what Biko was calling for. In the separation of spaces, he was saying, not only do we need the space in the physical realm, but also mind over matter. You need a space where you could grow organically rather than being fed what Brother Milton said earlier, which is you're basically being propagandized against your own best interests. You've given them a religion, you've decided one day of the week is when you all congregate. And even in congregation, the book being used has been crafted in such a way that you've not only been denigrated in that book for perpetuity, because essentially if you're reading the same thing over and over again, and you, as the world goes on, multiply, you're going to be passing on your generation's trauma onto the next generation. So wherein he wrote for that time contextually, that time can also now be exponentially looked at across the world. In the United States, as we currently speak, they are trying to rewrite history. In Britain, it is removing history, the one that empowers you, from the curriculum. There's a gentleman by the name Hamid Abdi, who is, how can I say, he is the most prominent voice when it comes to African history. His school in Chichester, of which he is a preeminent chair, is being devalued and being locked down as we speak. And so when you have that constant drumbeat of pulling away at the fabric of your very existence, it is only right and proper that we not only pick up the pen, but we also exercise our agency of voice, which is to say, this is the way we need to go. And once you've determined that, anything that is going to get in the way, you sidestep it. If you can't go around it, if you can't go through it, you sidestep it. And don't waste unnecessary energy on things that, how can I say it, that will draw strength from the power of the movement.
So for me, the state of South Africa is the state of the global existence of Black people. The story of, as I was reading this book, I was seeing myself here in the United States and myself being the Black community. I was seeing myself in Kenya. I was seeing myself in Brazil. I was seeing myself in Haiti. Not even thinking of who's the majority in that environment, but still seeing that those environments are controlled by white supremacy and whiteness. And so I think it's very important. And this is Steve Biko says this. SASO has a specific role to play, and it has been set up as the custodian of non-white interests. It can best serve this purpose by maintaining only functional relationships with other student organizations, but not structural ones. And that's the essence of it. When we are talking about structural building, structural community organizing of Black community, of healing our community, of going back into our culture, of connecting with our languages, of mending the separation that was created by colonialism, of decolonizing our minds, we cannot have the oppressor in the room. We cannot have white people in the room. We cannot have that culture that did those things to us in the room, because it's a contradiction. And Steve Biko talks about it. I encourage everyone to buy the book. He talks about how they consistently, before they built SASO, were put back. They were held back as far as progress, as in terms of liberation, always held back by the liberals, the white people who you thought were allies and you allowed in the space. So for me, it is Black spaces only if we're going to get to liberation. And that topic leads us perfectly into the issue of fragmentation that Steve Biko talks about. He's talking about how we as Black people are fragmented. This is one of the areas where we are fragmented, interestingly enough. Some of us think we need white people in those spaces, and some of us, like I, think that we need those spaces to be only for Black people if we're going to heal and walk towards liberation. Brother Adesoji, what do you think about that? Fragmentation, the different ways the Black community has been fragmented. And Steve
Okay,
Biko's work.
before we move into fragmentation, I just want to add on to something. I think because people that are not familiar with Biko's work might conclude that he was a separatist, which of course was not the case. I think Biko was speaking at a particular time in South Africa's history, because of course his vision was to have a socialist state where race, in fact, would not be a determining factor at all, so that it did not matter whether you were European ancestry, whether you were Indian,
And
but you would have to, of course, realize that this is a country that is governed by an African majority. So if you accepted that, you were welcome. But in this particular phase of the struggle, of course, the Black space was essential. It was the only way, in fact, that they would be able to liberate South Africa from apartheid. Because he's saying that the spokesperson for the oppressed cannot be elements of the oppressor class as well. Because he said, as far as they may profess their liberalism, even the poorest of the working class European South Africans also had an aversion to being close to Africans. Why? Because he was a beneficiary of apartheid. So even he would oppose the end of apartheid, because if apartheid were to end, he would not have the reserved work allocation for him purely just because of his race. So I wanted to make that distinction, because in the end of the day, Biko was a socialist who in fact said the situation in South Africa is a microcosm of the global struggle of the oppressed versus the oppressor, the have-nots versus the have-nots. So he said it was a microcosm for the relationship between the industrialized so-called developed world, which exploits the so-called third world and takes the resources. It was a narrow context of a broader context, both sharing the same, occupying the same space and operating at the same time.
Brother Adesoji.
yes, I'll piggyback on what Brother Milton just said now with regards to his umbrella thoughts. Yes, Biko was all of that, including the notion of self-empowerment, which is very important to underline. Now, the reason I bring that up is there was a particular incident where he was speaking to, they went for a conference, and at that conference, somebody pushed back against the thought of Indians being in the room. And Biko went, ballistic, to put it mildly. But then also in so doing, was able to garner the respect of the person he chastised, because he said, you never quite can tell who is going to have your backs. Yes, you can be strident with regards to who you don't want in your corner, but you shouldn't do that in, you know, casting everybody by the same light. So, why do I mention that? Again, I like the notion of dates. Dates anchor context and time. That was just before the Sharpeville massacre, certainly long before the Soweto uprising, and certainly long before apartheid fell. Now, those three dates are pivotal moments. When we're talking about fragmentation of Black causes, Black unity, who is the president of South Africa at the moment? Cyril Ramaphosa. Cyril Ramaphosa was the head of the National Union of Miners. Stephen Biko made mention of the notion that you should not replace the white oppressor with someone who just looks like you, because they will end up doing the same thing. When the massacre happened at the mine, the plutonium mines, who was the president of South Africa? The same Cyril Ramaphosa. You see how the moment you become what you're trying to run away from, and you get the power, you garner the power, that power should then be used in the cause that it was determined for in the first place, as opposed to centering yourself. Because it's so easy for a pseudo socialist to become a capitalist. It's so easy because they were not truly socialists in the first place. So they just cast and say, oh, socialism is not practical. But somebody made mention of something, which is the beauty of, or the sly hand of capitalism is they socialize the risk, but privatize the profits. So they're quite happy for the government of the state to buy everything, to, give you tax breaks and what have you. So what Stephen Biko was speaking to here is we could have so many bodies, but they need to be synergy. There needs to be synergy. The Inkatha Freedom Party was one that constantly played, the drumbeat of being reactionary during the apartheid movement. And then once that became the order of the day, Biko saw through that and decided, you know what, this sort of problem has to be highlighted. And there were a lot more. Even the ANC will piggyback upon what the Pan-African Congress would build with regards to what led to the Sharpeville massacre, which was the rejection of the past. At that time, the ANC too wanted to go slow until they said, okay, here's an opportunity for us to get in. And before you know it, we're up in it.
Again, I'm muted again. So do we move on to fragmentation, or do you still want to talk about Black-only spaces? Or
No, I want to mention fragmentation because, of course, that is
Thank you.
Way that all systems of exploitation exist, right, historically.
Mm-hmm.
The colonialism would not have been enabled without fragmentation, without divide and rule. At the end of the day, my students ask me, Professor, how is it that relatively few Europeans could control so many millions of Africans.
Very
And I
good
tell them,
question. Mm-hmm.
it was not only, Africans, uh, regions, subcontinent of India, uh, uh, China. These were also people that were subjugated by relatively a few Europeans. Although, of course, they had the technology, but the technology could, even if you have guns could not have been trained on all the millions of Africans. You see, but but when they were superb when it came to divide and rule, and they knew the leaders to influence. Uh, they knew how to exploit historical differences that always exist in all societies. They embraced that. They knew how to elevate others as somebody who's much more special relative to the rest of them. We had that even on plantations.
Mm-hmm.
Malcolm talks about, the field Negro and the house Negro. So that is the basic concept. You can make it much more sophisticated and multiply it, but it starts from that same premise of exploiting any differences to the maximum, so that at the end of the day, you have the oppressed, the ones who are actually policing themselves. One of my favorite lectures is Race and Class in Guyanese Politics, Walter Rodney's, where he talks about the ruling planter class in colonial Guyana after the abolition of slavery, now bring in ethnic Indians from the subcontinent and actively promote divisions between the two. So now they're competing against each other for the crumbs, and they're denigrating each other and abusing each other, rather than saying, wait, time out. Let's focus on our common condition and what we could actually do collectively to benefit from the exploiter. So that exists in all societies, and in South Africa, um, it was, of course, elevated and magnified by the apartheid state, which, as Adesoji pointed out in 1948, legalized the historical racism that had already been manifested in South Africa. So now you start throwing crumbs. You tell Buthelezi of Inkatha, oh, you're a bit special. So we'll create a state for you, a state within South Africa. And, many, people in that context want to be elevated, you know,
Mm-hmm.
even to the form of being a fake president. So you create Transkei, Bophuthatswana, and you call these states. And Steve Biko is saying, number one, you're talking about 13%. So by accepting that, first of all, you are acceding the rest of the country to the white ruling oppressor class. But even much more dangerous, you're now not looking at the prize. You're not fighting to end apartheid and bring down the apartheid state. You're fighting to get more benefits for your little fake state.
Mm-hmm.
Your Futaswana, your Transkei within South Africa. And that was the danger. And of course, he was completely 100% absolutely right. Those fake states eventually crumbled, within themselves. And Steve Biko's was an early advocate of the need to have one mass movement. It didn't happen the way he foresaw it, because obviously he had been killed by the time the the fight intensified against apartheid. But it still happened in the form of everybody coming within that united democratic front movement. The trade unions, the political parties, the youth organizations,
Mm-hmm.
football clubs, the women's organization, all started acting on one agenda. Let's forget about our differences. Our number one agenda should be to bring down the apartheid state. The way he had been advocating when he was alive was that the ANC, the PAC, all the other resistance parties and organizations should all come together under one umbrella. So it took a different shape and form, but ultimately that was what also helped bring down the apartheid state.
Yeah. He also talks about, you mentioned the youth. He talks about the youth, Adisoji, before we move on to you. He mentions the youth struggling with the older blacks in South Africa because the youths wanted to get it done, and the older blacks were talking about he calls it the go slow attitude. And
Right.
we're facing that today, and a lot of our going back is to see how we can bring back lessons from then, how we can bring back lessons from what Steve Biko is talking about to today, to the movement today, because we are in a movement, whether you believe it or not. We are being oppressed, we are being exploited. And if you are in your luxurious mansion, driving your nice car, eating well, having your suits to your children going to private schools, and you think that Black people are doing well because of that, you're delusional, and self-serving is what you are.
And he
So,
warned against that specifically,
right,
not in this book, but people that haven't seen that interview, if you go to Google, I'm sorry, go to YouTube
YouTube.
and put Steve Biko interview, and an interview of about 24 minutes. He speaks to that. He said there would have been as if no change had occurred if all we do is we don't change the fundamental aspects of the system economically. Then it would have been as if no change happened if we just changed the white rulers with the new black rulers. And unfortunately, that is, of course, the situation that prevails today in South Africa. You know.
Yeah. Adesoji, fragmentation.
So speaking to that, let's look at the continent. Fragmentation. The continent itself was broken up into glorified plantations called countries. Some of them, we've got 14 landlocked countries, and they're not self-sustaining. And in the countries that are self-sustaining, say Kenya, for instance, certain people were displaced. And the land is now used to produce things that the local population do not need to buy what they do need. Make that make sense. In Zimbabwe, the same thing. So when he spoke about fragmentation, that's why I say his writing is timeless. It's timeless in the sense that he speaks to the youth agitation to bring forth change. But then again, that ties into class struggle, which, as Kwame Nkrumah wrote, you have certain people who have gained, quote unquote, the education of the oppressor class, which goes into a chapter touched upon in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney, where he says the kind of education you got is just for you to serve them. It's not a liberated type education. It's so that you make their work easier. And the fact that they see you there working, people who look like you might think, oh, by virtue of your being close to them, you've gained a special status. And that becomes the ambition as opposed to total freedom. So coming together is going to be not impossible, but it's hard difficult because you're going to have to win people off the notion that they're special than the next person. So I would have to, concede and say, Brother Steve Biko was way ahead of his time
Most
in
definitely.
the paper with regards to, this book.
I want to go back a minute, sister, to youth before you move away from that you
Yes.
brought up. Youth, of course, important, but not sufficient. You need youth, and then you need conscious youth. So if you look at the resistance such as that led to the Soweto uprising, it was no accidental that it happened at a time of the heightened conversation about Black consciousness. So Steve Biko and his contemporaries, the leadership, were having tremendous impact. And it's amazing because he himself would be considered a youth, really. He was in his 20s, when he was at the peak. of his intellectual advocacy, right? But of course, in this context, we're talking about the teenagers, the young people that actually went out to the streets. Their consciousness had been transformed by listening to many of these conversations that Biko and his contemporaries were having. The writings, the seminars they were conducting, appearing on whenever they were allowed in certain radio spaces. So this really changed their mindset, and they became much more confident, of course, and much more daring and willing to engage the apartheid state. And in fact, he also writes that they actually that this may not be in the book, but it's in that same interview that I recommended, that their attitude also changed the attitude of their parents, the old guard. They started realizing that, wow, the youth are right after all. And even the parents became a little more bolder and much more daring before. So I just wanted to add that in.
Thank you, brother Alimadi. I'll say, Brother Steve Biko is stretching our decolonized, or at least the state of decolonization of our minds. He is testing it with what he is writing, and the things that he's talking about. I fear that our community today is not at the, I'm glad we are comfortable to talk about it on Kumbukeni, but it will not be welcome in many spaces today where people are trying to live their comfortable lives. We're going to move on to integration. He moves from talking about Black spaces to fragmentation to integration, the myth of integration. And this has been seen a lot in the civil rights movement in the United States. You've heard people who are not too fond of Dr. King because he was encouraging integration. And today we look back, we're grateful for everything Dr. King did for us. Let me not be mistaken for saying I do not appreciate him. But we look back today and we can honestly sit back as a Black community and ask ourselves, at least we should sit back and ask ourselves, what has integration gotten us? As far as our freedom, as far as our access, as far as equity, what has integration gotten us? So Biko is calling out integration in many ways. Brother Adesoji, let's speak on this.
Well, you could look at it through two lenses. One is contextual, another one is the present time in which we live. Contextual, to fight, you first of all have to empower yourself. And so when he says integration, it's almost like asking to come up out of the water for air so that you breathe. You need to breathe first to be able to fight. So in so doing, yes, you integrate, but integration based on knowing yourself first, which is the essence of the Black consciousness movement. Now, in integrating, once you know yourself, you know what it is you want and you know what it is you would reject. And so, he's also clear with regards to that. Now, to give it a more contextual time, I'm talking about contemporary times now. Yeah, we may look back and say, yeah, but what has it benefited the Black people if we look on the global space? Victories are not won at once. Like someone once said, you could win a battle and lose the war. It is important to win the war. The war is much more important. Certain battles are the victories from them are granular. So you might not see what it is. But then if you can move around and pursue other things, not rest on your laurels, that in itself is a victory for integration. So in South Africa today, let's use South Africa. The Africans the Black South Africans can move around. Yeah. Okay, they're denied certain aspects of the country, but that is still part of the conversation. Last week, I believe, we did EFF. What was the basis of their agitation? It's the return of land without compensation. So again, you have to move from point to point. You can't, my people will say in Yoruba, you can't, we take one leg out of our trousers, one at a time. You don't jump out of your trousers. So in so doing, yes, you integrate, but then you empower. You use that integration to empower yourself. So, has he served us? Yeah, partly. Has he also denied our truthful existence? Some could say so. But overall, I would still say yes, we're still a work in progress. You know, who was it that said, in every solid rock, there is a statue waiting to come out? How do you get at that statue? You chisel at it, one chip at a time. Eventually, you will get there. So, I would say Brother Biko was right, but I also think he tempered his need for integration on the premise which Brother Milton said earlier, that yes, you do so, but on the basis of self-awareness, self-consciousness, which were all the tenets of his movement, the Black Conscious movement. And so, yeah, I'm all for it. Even Dr. King said at some point, he said, the white liberals are the problem. He knew what the problem was. But would he rather stay where he was while fighting the white liberals? Of course not. You move forward gradually. Yes.
It's interesting because even in our discussion, you can see the fragmentation, which is okay. Brother Ali Mahdi, this issue of integration and whether it has helped us or not.
Integration is, first you have to analyze what it really means. There's a danger that when they say integration, there's a certain meaning that the establishment want people to understand. And in the 60s, of course, that would have a certain appeal in the United States. If you say integration, meaning, okay, my children will now, because of quote unquote integration, have access to good schools that previously were reserved only for European Americans. My children will now not be denied access to certain swimming pools, parks, restaurants. Will they now be able to send their resume and be considered for certain jobs? Is that what they mean by integration? Well, there's a segment of society which would understand it that way, and that would be appealing to them as well. But what is also being said is that the status quo, the system, the foundation of the economic and political system is untouchable, right? That's not even a part of the conversation anymore. Now we are focusing on quote unquote integration, right? Integrate into the system which is existing. So in other words, the system and the structure in South Africa is apartheid. So we are going to make apartheid a little less ugly by allowing you to integrate, by opening the doors. See? So there's some confusion there. But that's actually what they're saying. But a lot of people don't realize that that is what they're saying. But of course, a person like Steve Biko would understand that when they say integrate, they're saying integrate on our terms.
Yeah.
Let's modify the system. Let's reform the system on our terms. And of course, for a person like Steve Biko, the ultimate end should be revolution. If we're going to have socialism in South Africa, that cannot be done by a mere band-aid process of integration. You see, so there are a different conversation. Even here in the United States, Malcolm X said, "Oh, so now they're talking integration. So now they're saying we can all go to the same toilet. Is that what we're really fighting for?" You know, he has
Malcolm
magic,
was great with words. He was
magic
great.
with words.
He was great with words.
Right. But on another note, Dr. King, listen to the mountaintop speech, the last speech he made
Yes.
before he was shot the next day. What is he talking about? He's talking about don't spend your money in spaces where you're not wanted. Right? He's being very explicit now, saying don't buy a certain type of bread. Buy this certain type. Why would you buy a certain type of bread when they don't even hire you? They don't even want you. Why would you put your money in certain types of banks? Put it in Black-owned banks. In other words, spend within your community and empower your own community. Dr. King actually was coming much, much closer to Malcolm's position. And in some respects, Dr. King was also ahead of Malcolm's position in some respect. And I say this because if you listen to why I am opposed to the Vietnam War, that was a critique of capital. Malcolm was coming toward that position as well at the end of his life, when he had met people like Sekou Touré, he had met Nkrumah, he had met Babu, Abdurrahman Babu, who was very influential, really, in enlightening Malcolm when it comes to critique of capital. But so listen to that speech by Dr. King, you know?
Yeah.
So I actually respect Dr. King a lot more than a lot of people do. I think he had an understanding of capitalism and the destruction of capitalism. And he was talking about what capitalism was doing in South America, for example, and in African countries. A lot of people, unfortunately, are not familiar with that Riverside Church speech. One of my favorite speeches, in fact, you know.
That's the last speech before he is assassinated, right?
No, that's not it.
Okay.
That one, the last speech before assassinated was the mountaintop speech. But the Riverside speech is much more detailed and much more global in its critique of capital. Talk about the destruction of what capital was doing in Africa, in South America, let alone in the United States itself. You know, and in fact, that speech is the reason why he lost so many quote unquote liberal friends.
Yeah, and here we go with Biko talking about the liberals.
Yep. He was attacked in some of the media that used to embrace him, quote him all the time, allow him to write editorials. Suddenly he was going to the third rail, talking about the untouchable, the sanctity of capital and capitalism, which is, of course, what Biko was also doing. Yeah.
Biko, there are 3 questions that he asks, and I'm going to just read them out. 2 of them to the liberals, but one of them just to all of us as we read him. He asks, how many white people fighting for their version of a change? And it is their version because, like Alimadi just pointed out, they're telling you how to go about your change. In South Africa are really motivated by genuine concern and not by guilt. So that's a question that we should all sit with as Black people. As you make excuses for them, as you try to accommodate them, as you try to apologize for wanting a space for you only, you should ask yourself that. These allies, are they helping us because they're feeling guilty and they don't want to feel guilty anymore? Or are they truly and genuinely concerned? And as I speak about this, I should make it very clear. We do have John Browns. We do have white people.
Shame on you. You took the words out of my mouth.
I'm sorry. I am not ashamed at all.
I was about to say, how many of you are John Browns?
We do have John Browns. I have had the experience of working in a space where certain people call themselves allies. And today, events have proved that they were not true allies. They were not John Brown. And we're not saying go out and kill people. That's not what we're saying. We're saying, are you willing to risk your comfort to support Black people? Are you willing to risk that invitation to the country club to support Black people? Are you willing to lose your job at the New York Times to support the Black community and stand up and say that George Floyd's it was a murder and nothing else but a murder? So and to the liberals,
and I think you probably answered that question actually.
Yeah.
After the brutal execution of Floyd, you saw all that outpouring, right? All the support, financial support to all these organizations now, with all these, wealthy establishment elite, literally just Googling, going up and Google, Black organization. Okay. Call them up. Funds.
You should have seen the Black Lives Matter signs in my town.
Where's all of that today?
I don't see them.
Where's all of that today? And this thing was just literally yesterday,
Yeah.
But go ahead.
He goes on quickly, Adesoji. He goes on to ask the liberals, since you are aware that the problem is white racism, why do you not address yourselves to the white world? Why are you here talking to us? That's me adding that. Why are you in my Black space talking to me about how I should change instead of going to your country club and talking to them about how oppressive they are and how wrong they are? And Biko asks again another question. Why do you insist on talking to Black people? Why do you insist on being in my Black space talking to me about how I should go about liberation? Brother Adesoji, you were saying.
Well, I was just going to chime in with that to say, well, when Brother Milton brought up the issue of where the so-called white liberals are post George Floyd, said, well, they've gone back to sleep.
They're back in the country club sipping their champagne and eating steak.
So they've gone back to sing and bringing it into the concept of white racism and Black consciousness. You have to understand that comfort, it's a very empowering drug that people would not want to inconvenience themselves if they don't have to. And 2020 was an example of what to see when you're talking about of how to view it when you're talking about, because they had nothing to do. So it was convenient. They had nothing to do. You couldn't go anywhere because there was a lockdown. So, okay, is this what we're doing now? Okay, fine. Let's go for a march. Yeah, dress our babies in Black Lives Matters t-shirt. But ask yourself now, if having to turn up to work tomorrow, would you make that conscious decision to go on a march? You won't. You won't. And that's the truth of the matter. So it's not hard to discern. It's not hard to discern.
Here's a question from me as we continue to have the conversation. Why is it so hard for us to comprehend the fact that two things can be true? Yes, we can have Black spaces where it's only Black people talking about Black issues and Black solutions. And yes, we can come out of them and go sip a drink with white friends, white colleagues, white allies, whatever you want to call them. And yes, there can be Black spaces that work with white people and they work with them well. All that can be true. All I'm saying is, for me, Nduko, I want a Black space, and I am glad to see that my brother, Steve Biko, is with me on this.
I don't think you're saying anything unique. I occupy a Black space. I have a Black-owned media, and, I have Black writers, I have Black editors. So I understand that and I relate to it. And not only do I understand it, but actually I practice it, you see? So that's on one level. And I don't see why it cannot coexist with, non-Black spaces. And that is the reality. So on that level, we're on the same page. I was just trying to explain that at that particular time in history, they had no choice but to have that Black space. And during the Haitian Revolution, I don't imagine that they were bringing in non-Africans at the initial stages of the resistance and the
That would be
uprising.
amazing to actually, yeah.
Why would they want to do that and risk have betrayals and all that? When in fact you have occasions where even fellow Africans would be betraying you.
Them, yeah.
So that initially 100% black space. And in later stages, of course, they had some people within the other side who realized the system was crumbling and started coming to help them as well. So I think the importance is just the context in which we say this. I, of course, started Black Star News because I had worked for European-owned and European corporate-dominated media. And I saw that, they cannot tell my story. They cannot articulate the needs of my community. So I created, actually, first I worked with a publication called The City Sun. I left, I was a freelance reporter for the New York Times, but I left that to go to The City Sun. And even the publisher of The City Sun couldn't believe I was leaving the New York Times to work for The City Sun. He said, I can only pay you 20% of what they pay you in the New York Times. I said, that's not the point. I understand what exactly you're trying to do. What you're delivering can only be delivered by a Black-owned and controlled publication. And that is why I want to work for you. And I did. And when he passed on and joined the Ancestors and the publication went down, I realized there was no way I was going back to the white spaces.
Yeah.
And I drew up a business plan, started sending it out to Black folk that I knew had wealth. And many of them said, good idea, good luck, But I was fortunate that Camille Cosby cut me a check for the seed money to start it. So I am totally a big supporter of Black spaces. I'm a big supporter of Black HBCUs. I would hope that Black people with resources could support them much more financially. I am, as an adjunct professor, I'm at both Columbia and John Jay, and I have to tell you that happily, I'm much happier when I'm teaching students at John Jay. So I am all for the Black spaces. I'm a big believer in it.
See, I come out and say something like Black HBCUs, rather HBCUs, I'm being repetitive. HBCUs is a great example of integrating into a system that will never allow you to be fully you. And that's a conversation we can have at another time. Steve Biko talks about culture. He talks about how this oppressive system has taken us away from our culture, the effects of it on African culture. And one of the examples he gives is the way we misunderstood the rural elders who were against education. And now he sits back as he's writing and he realizes that they actually were making a good point, because they were saying this education is taking you away from your culture. These children go, and we've read different stories. We've read Ayikwe Ma, who talks about this. These children go to school and they come back and they have no respect for their elders. Why? Because they have gone to school and they've been told that the way of their elders is backward. It is barbaric. So why would they have respect for them? They go to school and they're told that the way they eat is not the right way to eat. So they come back and they don't want that food. And I remember growing up pushing back on culture, some of the aspects of African culture. And now that I know better, I beat myself up about it every now and then, but it does no good to do that. So now I must do better and teach future generations the importance of our culture. So Adesoji Alimadi, our culture, what damage has this infection by the oppressor caused on our culture, and what can we do to get it back?
Well, the Yorubas will say, "Akinfowosi juwele," which is you do not point to your father's house with your left hand. But that's the literal interpretation. The colloquial interpretation of that is you first of all know who you are, which is know who you are, which is the root of the Black consciousness movement. Knowing yourself. When you know yourself, whatever anybody gives to you, only adds to that. It doesn't replace it. It doesn't. I speak English. I can speak English with anybody. But then when I get into spaces where my language takes center space, I will speak my language. So, and my language brings, I mean, it's in my name. So that alone tells you a lot about who I am. So what Biko is agitating for, or what he's trying to promote, is don't think whatever it is you're going to get over there is much more valuable than much more valuable than what you already have. I mean, Brother Milton spoke to it quite eloquently earlier, which was, you don't just create a system when we're talking about integration. What are you integrating to? I.e., what are you giving up to get what it is you're being promised? That is very important. What are you giving up? If you give up your essence, then you become a shell. And so shells will be filled. And so when you come back home and you're saying, oh, I don't want to eat sadza, or I don't want to eat eba, or I don't want to eat because of the way it looks. Or even if you want to eat it, I'm going to eat it with the finest cutlery on a big bowl lined with 16 spoons on either side, 16 knives, It's like, why? On the basis of what? On the basis of what? So yes, culture is very important. It's also the grounding path for revolution. I'm still looking for the book, The African Cultural Revolution by Okot Pitek, where the basic tenets of that is you center yourself. That is your means to revolution. And who brought that revolution to fore? Amilcar Cabral. He built his entire revolution on the concept that your culture takes center stage. And once your culture takes center stage, you immediately know what it is you need to do, when you need to do it, and how you need to do it. So culture is important.
I said to my mother the other day, to her surprise, that I was going to go back to African spirituality and start looking into it. So my mother, who has embraced Christianity, was quite shocked. But yes, that is part of it. We start going back to our culture. I'm currently getting ready to start teaching Kiswahili to Black people, and part of it will be teaching how to cook ugali, and part of it will be teaching how to eat ugali when you're with people who are eating ugali, and not bring your fork and your knife and insult them. Brother Ali Mahdi, did you speak on integration? Are we moving on to the next one? I forget.
No, on culture.
On culture, yes, please. Culture.
So, obviously, as Brother Desoji pointed out, culture goes hand in hand with revolution, because culture allows you to reject the distorted person that you've become as a result of conquest and colonialism, subjugation to their culture, which of course comes by insisting that you must reject your culture, which is inferior. It's supposed to be inferior. And before you come to that realization, and that's what Black consciousness was all about, actually, really, to be able to reject the distorted person that you have become as a result of the distorted miseducation that you've been subjected to. You've been taught to sing the praises of your conqueror, right? So in South Africa, you would observe Kruger Day, right? You would be singing the praises of the people who brought apartheid to your country.
That was so insane when I saw that. I was like, are we actually really, do they actually celebrate the day that they were invaded and taken over? And these white people expect the Black people to attend with smiles on their faces?
Well, sadly, and in time, some Black people would start attending.
Shame on them.
No, but it's not really shame. It's
shame on them, 100%.
Lack of knowledge.
Knowledge.
Once you've been totally distorted, you can do
Any
the most amazing things, and that's a whole different conversation. We have, African people that hate themselves.
yeah.
We have African people that wish they were European, and that comes through a process, you see.
Hmm.
But what I like about what Biko, the way he laid it out from the very beginning, because as he's laying it out, you see the contrast, and you see how superior, the culture that is being denigrated actually is.
Mm-hmm.
And this is true for all African communities. You can just go in and join any conversation. Nobody's going to say, "Who are you?
Yep.
Why are you becoming a part of this conversation? We don't know you." He said, "There's no such thing as having a best friend, that you
Mm.
can just have one friend."
Everyone's a
What
friend.
kind of concept is that,
Unity.
right? He said, "We communicate very easily and readily." He says, "Our initial thought is not suspicion.
Mm-hmm.
Our initial thought is, oh, what is he up to? What is
Which
she
is
up to?"
probably why we were invaded, but yeah.
Of course,
Yeah.
it is the reason why. And part of that tradition and culture also is the music.
Mm-hmm.
We sing during funerals. We sing during weddings. We sing when we are going to war, engage in war. We're singing. We sing when we are working, even hard labor, right? Even if we're digging, there's a certain rhythm to the digging,
Mm-hmm.
accompanied by music. And the music is all embracive. It's a community music. It's for all of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then it goes to look at even the way we lived in villages, right? You have a built-in social security. You
Mm.
cannot suffer total impoverishment because somebody is bound to have a little something, and that will be shared. The land is not seen as belonging to just an individual, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's to the community. Even though you may farm parts of the land individually or for your family, it still belongs to everybody, the land itself. And when you're doing the farming, you have no shortage of labor because all you have to do is ask. Others will come and join you
Exactly.
and provide labor, knowing that when the time comes and you are asked, you will also go on and join in the labor. So culture, of course, is I can't find a word to describe it, but it's so essential. It makes us
Mm-hmm.
as African people who we are. And Brother Desoji is right. Cabral made it a very important aspect of the liberation struggle.
Yes.
Even before the liberation struggle, when he was still a student in Portugal, and he would come home on vacation uh, to Guinea-Bissau, and I think he had a radio station I think it was on the Cape Verde part. The show was focusing on African culture,
Culture.
and he was talking about return to the roots.
Yeah.
What happened? The Portuguese authorities were smart enough to know that this is actually a form
See,
of resistance that is very widespread. What
but
did they do?
they
They
shut it.
banned it. And after they banned it, this is when they started creating a file for Cabral as well.
Yeah.
And let me also add two other things actually on the aspect of culture, because Rodney also talks about it in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. The importance of these initiation groups where young men go through rites of passage and they learn all these skills. It's
Mm-hmm.
almost like an apprenticeship, right?
Yes.
And that structure was all destroyed by the colonial regime, because they knew the importance of these young men going through the tradition, going through the training, and going through the culture as well. So my final point I wanted to make on that aspect was Baker, Samuel Baker. And here is where we go back when you said, oh, they're crazy when they sing the praises of the conqueror.
I mean, on the day they were conquered.
I've used this example before.
Mm.
Samuel Baker, and some of you listeners who have read my book, Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media, may be familiar with Samuel Baker, one of the most racist of the so-called explorers, who said Africans should not be compared to the noble character of the dog, right? In his book, Albert Nyanza. In Uganda, of all the people, believe it or not, it was Idi Amin, one of the most, vicious Western, by the way, imposed dictators that we've had in Africa. But he was the one that changed the school from Samuel Baker to a indigenous Luo word, Pongduan, in Uganda. After Amin was overthrown, the post-Amin regimes changed the name back to Sir Samuel Baker Secondary School.
Can you imagine that?
That's only part one. Listen to part two. Part two, and I think I've given this example already. A few years ago, the alums of Sir Samuel Baker did a fundraising and raised a lot of money. And the money was not for scholarships for young Ugandans to go to Sam Baker or from there to go to college. The money was to build a statue.
Oh my God.
Of Sir Samuel Baker that stands in front of the school today. Okay? So I wanted to give you that example.
Thank you very much for pushing that button.
I would also like to add, just in line with that frame of thought, in 2014, which marks the 100 years of Nigeria's amalgamation of the Southern and Northern Protectorate, they called out a roll call of the greatest Nigerians ever. And one name was prominent there. It was Lord Lugard.
You can't even make this stuff up.
You see, the thing is, when I saw it, I was just like, I give up.
Are we talking about the same Lugard who did all the...
No, I mean, you don't even need to say who.
Yeah, he became the colonial governor in Nigeria. He was also in East Africa.
I am going to go out saying this: Black people, we need to do better. We need to be informed, and we are going to help you. Do not worry, we will help you be informed.
Lugard said the African is so inferior that he does not mind being subjugated by Europeans. Anything otherwise, he would see it as an insult.
Which is why someone in Florida who calls themselves a leader think that they can get away because they have gotten away with saying that slavery was actually a good thing for us.
Yes, of course.
This is all related.
He saw what Trump did, and he believes that's going to take him all the way to the White House. Sister, if you give me your indulgence, may I read just 4 lines? Please?
Yes, please. Go ahead. Yes.
We reject the power-based society of the Westerner that seems to be ever concerned with perfecting their technological know-how while losing out on their spiritual dimension. We believe that in the long run, the special contribution to the world by Africa will be in this field of human relationship. The great powers of the world may have done wonders in giving the world an industrial and military look, but the great gift still has to come from Africa, giving the world a more human face. That is from Biko in the chapter Some African Cultural Concepts.
And to add to that, I am going to say to the oppressor and his kind and those who defend his system, sit back and learn, because we are about to teach you how to relate to your fellow human beings. Let's talk religion quickly before we close out. He talks about religion. I was happy to see this one because any serious person who's talking about liberation must tackle the issue of religion. And he's talking about, he summarizes it in 3 points. I will quickly read from him. Biko says that his major criticism of the church is that it makes Christianity too much. And for those of you who want to go ahead and say that Islam was as harmful, yes, we agree. Again, 2 things can be true at the same time. It makes Christianity too much of a turn the other cheek. And I remember this growing up. Oh, Lord, do I remember this? You're a good person if you turn the other cheek. Religion whilst addressing itself to a destitute people. So the invader comes in, he oppresses you, and then he teaches you a religion that even when he's oppressing you, you should turn the other cheek and you say, yes, Amasa. Okay, the second point, it is stunted with bureaucracy and institutionalization. The third point, it manifests in its structures a tacit acceptance of the system that is white equals value. And you can see that in the different churches and the homes in Africa with white, again, idols. It is limited by way too much specialization, which means only certain people can speak to religion, as if the others do not know how to relate to their God. Adesoji Milton Alimadi, please, religion, the touchy subject of Africa.
Well,
African
Biko says, as you can see now, sees the power of the church for its communal strength, and says the church must move with the present times. If the church, say the church in the United States today, say to DeSantis, what you're doing is unethical, is unchristian-like, guess what will happen? It will stop. So if you're to go back in time, the what's it called? Was it called the African? No, it was called the Dutch Reformed Church, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. Why was it reformed? It was reformed in the sense that prior they thought, okay, we're going to bring Christianity to you, you know, remove all the devilish tendencies within you. But as soon as they understood that the power was moving towards majority rule, the church became reformed. Again, that's the church morphing into seeing that, yes, the power is being eroded. What do we do? Brother Milton spoke to it earlier under integration. They absorb a few of you that would have been seen as agitators. If Brother Milton can go in there and say his mind, then maybe the church is not as bad as we make it out to be. You know, so can the church help? Yes, it can. And it needs to stop being a passive observer in the search or the struggle for justice. Brother Malcolm used the pulpits. Brother King used the pulpits. There are so many other African Americans who use the pulpits as the basis of a message to the people. It is time to start calling out institutionalized religion. That, okay, what's the point of this? Is it in terms of the people? Because you can't be advocating for the best of humanity while practicing something that runs entirely counter to the basis of the same thing. So it's just hypocritical for me. So, and that is what Brother Biko was speaking to. You know, so for me, it's the church just has to move with the times. Otherwise, it will be swept away. And in the UK, the old churches are basically emptied. Some of them are now being turned into pubs, which for those who
The
are not,
irony is quite something.
there are public drinking houses.
St. Elizabeth is now what?
Drinking for the Lord.
Elizabeth pub. That's quite
So
something.
they're now public drinking houses. I mean, in some cases, some towns have actually turned theirs into a library, you know. But
Listen, given
again,
the fact that those pubs usually have, let me not insult anyone, Brother Alimadi.
Yes. Well, I've already spoken a lot about the church. I contrasted in how Africans pray to their gods on a regular basis, acknowledge their gods at every point in their life on a daily basis. They didn't need a Sunday. They didn't need a building designated for that. But he also mentioned the importance of if you want to be relevant, then you have to preach Black theology. You see, you can't be promoting the same white supremacy church and think you're relevant to the aspirations of Black people in South Africa. And of course, Black theology, if it's you could make analogy with sort of liberation theology, of course, which became very prevalent in South America when you had some pastors actually taking advantage of the fact that they have a following and a congregation to not need permission from anybody to conclude that there cannot be a just God who would tolerate the system of American capitalist domination of our country in support for all these right-wing dictatorships and the death squads that the United States was sustaining in South American countries. In fact, Archbishop Ramiro was one of the famous martyrs for taking that position, killed by the death squads sponsored by the United States. So Biko obviously will support that type of church that is preaching liberation. If there's going to be a church, then he would prefer that it be that type of church. But of course, I think his first preference would be to constantly pray to our African gods,
Exactly.
as he put it in that chapter.
Exactly. And it's interesting because I couldn't help but laugh when I saw that by our brother Muata Garai. My favorite story of the week. Louisiana pastor locks himself in a prayer room in the hopes of combating crime. And so on that note, I will read something that Biko speaks of on that. And that's perfect, Muata Garai, that you gave us that to close with. Biko says, no nation can win a battle without faith. And if our faith in our God is spoiled by our having to see him through the eyes of the same people we are fighting against,
Yep.
then there obviously begins to be something wrong in that relationship. And he adds it as a reminder to the Black ministry and Black people that God is not in the habit of coming down from heaven to solve people's problems on earth.
I remember that sentence. I love that.
Again, my people, God is not in the habit of coming down from heaven to save your problems on earth. So that pastor who is locking himself in the prayer room, hoping that crime will be combated, might as well go to the community and speak to the youth and organize the youth and combat crime, because that is the ability that God has given him, his physical ability and his brain. So come on, y'all, his prayers. Ali Mahdi.
Well, concerning religion, I really can't add much to that. But I wanted to. Are we closing? Are we wrapping up soon?
We're wrapping up. It is 1:31, but please speak. Yes.
Okay, could you do me a favor? Could you post my email, malimadi@gmail.com?
In the comments?
Yes.
Okay.
So for our viewers.
Is it two L's?
Yes, MALLIMADI@gmail.com.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm going to be soon launching my We Love African History series again.
Oh.
Yeah, where we have a lecture for an hour and a half. Not really lecture. It's as you know, both of you participated, conversation. So for anybody who's interested, send me your email and I'll send you the upcoming syllabus. I'm about to put final touches on the syllabus for that.
And
but also,
can I quickly add something to that, since I was your student on that? Mm-hmm. Do not sign on if you're not ready to do the work, because at the beginning of the week, he assigns you pages and pages and pages to read.
Okay, but here's the good thing. You don't have to read everything, but read enough to feel comfortable that you can participate
to have
in
a conversation. Yes.
Because I don't believe in people coming to a class and just, not contributing. So read as much as you think you will have enough to.
And you will be asked to contribute. Do not think that you'll get away without being asked to contribute, which was a great thing. I mean, it's a great experience. If you want to learn African history and get actually involved, I suggest you take him up on his offer.
Thank you for that. And something very quick, sister. Earlier on, we were talking about the people that contributing shortly after George Floyd's vicious murder, and then naturally disappeared when it was no longer in the media. And then we raised the issue of, liberals becoming a part of the process. Is it out of guilt and then disappearing when they feel they've assuaged the guilt a little? I think even raising those questions, we're missing the bigger question. can you really blame them? I think the answer is probably no, because we are appealing to their sentiments. Because by doing that, they're not critiquing the system itself. They're not critiquing capitalism. They're saying these things happen because we have a certain economic structure and base. You see? So what is wrong for me if I'm in their shoes to feel bad? That was a brutal killing. Look what they did to Floyd. Let me give
Give
but
you
then
$50.
a year or two later, it's not on the headlines. Well, I don't feel that bad anymore, you know? So
You are all way too accommodating of these oppressors.
no. What I'm saying
Way
is
too
we
accommodating
are
for my taste.
missing the bigger conversation.
I
What we
agree.
need them to understand
It's systemic.
is that until we
I agree.
critique the system, we will always have that type of behavior. In fact, we have that type of behavior by fellow Africans
Exactly.
who also feel bad for a short time, but they don't realize what are the root of these types of manifestations. Because so long as the police are concerned, preserve the status quo, right? At all costs,
That is their job.
suppress the troubled makers.
That
So
is
if
literally
we
their
did
job.
not have that young girl who took that video as the evidence, nothing would have happened to that the police officers and his compatriots. Even though he did the actual knee, he had several fellow officers around him.
Yep.
And they all started concocting this false story, which would have survived had it not been for that.
For the video. Yeah.
So the lesson to take home for us who seek liberation is that we should organize against the system.
Absolutely, without a doubt.
The
It's a
system. We are
that-
going for the system.
Yeah,
Not
these
those
are-
who keep it running, but the system itself.
Absolutely. Steve Biko said the same thing. If we don't change the fundamental structure in South Africa, he wrote this in 1977. Think about it. He warned of the Cyril Ramaphosa's of today. You know, he was genuine, he was committed, he was thinking what might happen if we don't do these things. That to me is a very serious person.
Yeah. But also, as we speak of Steve Biko and as we close, in order to organize and plan how you're going to stand up against the system, do not have the liberal who's trying to remain comfortable in that room. That's just my opinion, because they will not allow you to organize against the system.
Absolutely. You need a committed revolutionary.
Yeah.
Like,
all right, brothers, any last words, any goodbyes?
Well, I feel blessed every weekend to join this space. It's very special, time of the day for me. And I hope that our viewers also feel that they're engaging on a certain level with us. So
I'm going to hold it up real quick as
look
we
forward to
honor
next
him
week.
and we thank him. Yes. That's the book that we were discussing today. And I will be starting, for those of you who want to read it collectively and discuss these issues together, Kumbukeni, I should say, I have chosen to do this. We will be running a discussion group on the book. So look out for the announcement when we're ready. Again, asanteni. To follow us, you can email if you have any concerns, any suggestions, email us on kumbukeni1@gmail.com. You can join our Patreon family at patreon.com/Kumbukeni, or you can subscribe again or encourage your family, your friends, the community to subscribe to youtube.com/@Kumbukeni1. What does your subscription mean? What does increased subscription to Kumbukeni mean outside of myself, Adesoji and Alimadi getting paid eventually? Is that you know how these white spaces run. If they see this popularity, they make your videos more available to people. It means that our brothers and sisters on the continent who need to learn about, and yes, on the continent who need to learn about the things we talk about, will have access. They will start seeing these videos pop up on their feed. So subscribe, encourage others to subscribe. Asanteni, siku njema, have a good weekend. Kwaherini.